Good evening and welcome to a special edition of The World, bringing you extended coverage of the unfolding crisis in Ukraine. Hello, I'm Beverley O'Connor. Well, the world is holding its breath, waiting to see what happens next after Russian President Vladimir Putin recognised Russia-backed separatists in 2 Ukraine territories and ordered his forces into the east of the country under the guise of a peacekeeping operation. Tonight, we'll look at what's happening inside Ukraine and the separatists' regions, talk to experts around the globe about what has led to this crisis and consider the regional implications. Now, in the latest developments, just a short time ago, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he did not believe Putin's play amounted to all-out war, but was seeking to cut diplomatic ties with Russia. World leaders have condemned Russia's actions as unacceptable, with the US telling the UN Security Council the peacekeepers' excuse by Russia is a nonsense. Ukraine says 2 of its soldiers were killed overnight and 12 more were injured by shelling by pro-Russian separatists. And the US has imposed some sanctions on Moscow, with the UK, EU, Australia and other nations expected to follow America's lead. In what's been described as a very dark day for Europe, Mr. Zelensky said it is a violation of his country's sovereignty.
This
is an act of aggression which lays a substantial groundwork for prospective escalation on the part of Russia. The militants that are occupying Ukrainian territories, we are aware of all the risks, and we call on Russia once again to resolve this issue through dialogue, where we sit at a negotiating table. We are ready to do that at any platform, and Russia is perfectly aware of this. And by the way, not only Russia. In recent months, we have held consultations with maturity with nearly all leaders of the European Union, the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, etc., with all of them. And we have proposed various kinds of dialogue where Russia would be represented. We have received their response, and that response came yesterday. We have seen it. Ukraine has to respond to it. We believe that there will be no war, full-blown war against Ukraine, and there will be no large-scale escalation from Russia.
A little while earlier, the UK's Health Secretary said he believed Russia's invasion has already begun. Sajid Javid criticised Russia's decision to deploy troops to breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine.
We've seen that he has recognised these breakaway eastern regions in Ukraine, and from the reports, I think we can already tell that he's sent in tanks and troops. So I think from that you can conclude that the invasion of Ukraine has begun.
Well, as Russia appears to be inching closer to conflict with Ukraine, the President, Volodymyr Zelensky, has told his country that the country is not afraid of anyone or anything. Journalist Olga Tokariuk joins us now out of Kiev. Olga, good to talk to you. Just such unprecedented times for your nation. What are you hearing about whether Russian forces have already started moving across the border yet?
Yes, there already have been several videos issued this night about Russian troops, like picturing Russian troops moving across the Ukrainian border, which is not controlled by the Ukrainian government, and moving further into Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And yesterday, Vladimir Putin, in his speech, he not only recognized these self-proclaimed republics, but he also made clear that actually his main goal is to destroy Ukraine, because he doesn't believe Ukraine has a right to exist as a sovereign and independent state, because he doesn't like the direction Ukraine has been going in these years, farther and farther away from Russia, introducing democratic reforms, decommunization, and other developments that have been happening here. So that, of course, has been perceived in Ukraine with a lot, of anger and a lot of frustration, but also a lot of determination to defend Ukraine, because what Putin basically says now, it's no longer about Ukraine's membership in NATO or, about recognition of the self-proclaimed republics. What he actually has in mind is to take Ukraine under Russia's control.
Yes, he made it very clear that he believed Ukraine didn't really exist as a country in its own right, that it was part of the spiritual essence of Russia. Now, those comments must make it very clear that there's going to be, you would think, an escalation of what has happened overnight.
Yeah, well, it's not very surprising, in fact, here in Ukraine, because Putin basically repeated what he wrote last summer in his infamous essay, in which, again, he claimed that Ukraine didn't have a right to exist as an independent state, and basically dehumanized Ukrainians, and their efforts to live in a prosperous, free and democratic country. So this is not a surprise to anyone here, and nor is his move to recognize the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk republics. But this is definitely an escalatory move, and we don't know what's going to happen next, because it's still an open question in what kind of borders Russia is going to recognize the statelets, whether in the territory that is already under control of pro-Russian groups, or in the wider territory, the whole encompassing whole territory of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, because now 2/3 of those regions are under the Ukrainian government control, and whether an assault on other Ukrainian regions and cities will follow. And in fact, in Ukraine, people reacted to that, by discussing, some mothers were discussing on Facebook about attaching stickers to their children's clothes, signing the blood type before they send them to school, because nobody can be sure there can be no Russian further aggression and even bombing of Ukrainian cities.
Yeah, so it's gone from a sense of hoping that that Russia was not going to escalate and that life in Kiev, for example, was getting on as normal. How has that changed, and what sort of sense is there about how you are going to be able to defend your country?
Well, life hasn't been normal here since Russia began its build-up on the Ukrainian borders almost 4 months ago. So since then, we've been receiving this news, and people, despite, trying to continue with living their normal lives, still were following the news and thinking of the ways to prepare. Well, what Ukraine is doing now is continuing to strengthen its military. The people are resolved to contribute in whatever ways they can to the resistance and to, standing up to further Russian aggression. But of course, also a coordinated, a strong and united response of the West is needed, both in terms of imposing sanctions on Russia, going after Russian money, Russian corrupt money in the West, because this is what really hits the Kremlin and Putin personally hard. And also in terms of supporting Ukraine by providing more defensive weapons, by providing more economic assistance, and by strengthening, also Ukrainian civil society, which is probably Ukraine's main strength and the main difference from the Russian increasingly authoritarian and, closed and autarkic regime.
Olga, give us a sense of how much support in these regions that Putin has named to be more aligned with Moscow. What percentage do you think there would be?
If we are talking about the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, it was very clear even yesterday, after Putin formally recognized them in violation of the international law, that very few people actually there were happy or were going to celebrate. We've seen several dozens of people only on the streets of Donetsk, because basically what is happening there, what has been happening there for the last 8 years since these territories were occupied by Russia, is a sense of fear that was installed there by these occupation authorities. These territories became gray areas of lawlessness, where secret prisons exist, where there is no free speech, no free media, no dissent. People can be put in basements and tortured and raped and put in the secret prisons just for, making a comment on social media, which would be perceived as a pro-Ukraine. So these territories already, were living in fear even before this latest move by Putin, and I'm afraid it's not going to change in the near future.
Olga, we are all thinking of you, and we will watch with interest how this unfolds. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, let's now take a look back at today's developments after Moscow declared that it now recognises the independence of Ukraine's Donbass region. Our Europe correspondent Nick Dole sent this report from Kiev.
The Russian president convened top officials in a carefully staged forum at the Kremlin. There was no dissenting opinion.
I consider it necessary to take a long overdue decision to immediately recognise the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic.
Referring to the government in Kyiv as those who took over, the Russian president demanded Ukraine call off combat operations in Donbass.
Otherwise, the responsibility for continuing the bloodshed will lay on the shoulders of the Ukrainian regime.
In recent days, the fighting in eastern Ukraine has gotten worse. Ukraine says the rebels have been trying to provoke a reaction to justify an invasion. The Russian president has ordered so-called peacekeeping forces to enter the region. Moscow says it now has the right to build military bases on Ukrainian soil after signing new treaties with the separatist leaders. But the government in Kyiv says it won't give up any territory and it expects support from the West.
We are not afraid of anybody or anything. We owe nothing to no one, and we will not give anything to anyone.
The international community was swift with its condemnation of Russia's actions.
The Secretary-General considers the decision of the Russian Federation to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine.
This is plainly in breach of international law.
The US has warned Kyiv could come under attack if Russia invades. While many people in the capital know of bomb shelters or country houses they can escape to, Jawid and his family have no such plans. The interpreter fled Afghanistan only to get stuck in another potential conflict zone while waiting for a Canadian visa. They have no local contacts, they don't speak the language and have very little money.
I don't know what to do finally. Meanwhile, it's about to start a war in Ukraine too, as I follow the news every day and I'm just worried that what will we do now? Because I ran from one war and now I'm involved in another one.
A reminder that what happens next in this crisis could affect the future of millions. Nick Dole, ABC News, Kyiv.
Well, the United States has led a wave of international condemnation against Russia after Putin announced those peacekeeping forces would move into separatist areas of eastern Ukraine. Speaking at an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council, the US's ambassador says Mr. Putin's actions are unprovoked and the international community has to react.
He calls them peacekeepers. This is nonsense. We know what they really are. In doing so, he has put before the world a choice. We must meet the moment and we must not look away. History tells us that looking the other way in the face of such hostility will be a far more costly path. Russia's clear attack on Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity is unprovoked. President Putin is testing our international system. He is testing our resolve and seeing just how far he can push us all. He wants to demonstrate that through force, he can make a farce of the UN. We must act together in response to this crisis.
Well, Russia has repeatedly said it's not going to invade Ukraine, but it has before, of course, as recently as 2014 when it seized Crimea. Yvonne Yong takes a look back at the ongoing conflict in the region.
We've heard a lot about the tensions in the Donbass region in Ukraine's east. It's made up of two smaller regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, where Ukraine has been fighting rebels backed by Moscow since 2014, when Russia invaded and annexed Ukraine's Crimea. Separatists claim all of this region, but in reality control about a third of the territory. More than half of the millions who live here identify Russian as their native language. And now these enclaves have been recognised by President Putin as independent republics. He wants to send troops there on what he calls a peacekeeping mission. In 2015, a 13-point peace deal was signed in Minsk, Belarus, but the opposing sides still can't agree on the terms. And according to the US, Moscow has been planning to stake its claim for some time now and ensure Ukraine never becomes a member of NATO as well. Russia can mobilise troops all around Ukraine, in Russian-controlled Crimea, Belarus, around the eastern borders, and even Moldova. Ukraine has fewer than half of Russia's 2.9 million soldiers. The US and other NATO allies have military personnel in neighbouring countries, but have made it clear they won't be sending combat troops to Ukraine.
Well, the UN Security Council heard a chorus of countries calling on Russia to withdraw its forces from eastern Ukraine and return to diplomatic negotiations. According to US officials, up to 190,000 Russian troops line the Ukrainian border from the east to the north in Belarus, where troops are engaged in extended military drills. Shashank Joshi is defence editor at The Economist. He joins us out of London. Shashank, this has really taken a whole new level and a new life of its own. What are you expecting to see over coming days with Russia's announcement today?
It is unexpected, it is dramatic, but I think it's all proceeding according to lines we could have roughly seen even before Christmas, a point at which Western officials were confident Putin did have a plan for an attack on Ukraine and that he was set on it and that its aim would be regime change. So I think this is still phase one. There's a temptation, I think, to believe that by recognizing these two breakaway republics that he has sort of finished his gambit. He has got what he wanted. He hasn't. By recognizing them, he has destroyed the Minsk agreements, which were his principal means of trying to get a constitutional veto over government decisions in Kiev. And he's put troops into Donbass. But of course, Russia has had troops there for 8 years covertly. So he hasn't got very much. But he's already incurred substantial cost. I've just heard, in fact, that Germany has suspended the certification of Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline. I think it is inevitable in the days ahead we will see Russia seek to expand control of the two territories' control. They only control a fraction of the territory in the Donbass region they lay claim to. And I think the fighting that results will provide a pretext for Russia to conduct wider strikes on Ukraine. That's my assessment. That's my prediction. It could be wrong, but I'm afraid so far this crisis has moved as I feared it would.
Yes, and we heard from his speech, which was sort of came out of the blue a little, despite weeks of negotiation and diplomatic negotiations. He made it very clear that he didn't even think Ukraine was a country and that it really belonged to Russia.
It was a frightening speech that sounded paranoid, perhaps even deranged to many people listening. But I would say that if you sort of look at it unemotionally and set aside the absurd theatrics of the speech, you know, in this cavernous room with, you know, delivering this to the two republics' leaders, it was stuff he said before. You know, the principal themes were along the lines of an essay he published last summer on Ukraine, as you say, declaring that Ukraine wasn't a real state, didn't really have sovereignty apart from Russia, and of course had turned into this anti-Russian project fomented by the West. But I will say, if you listen to that speech in, for example, Finland, another former Russian possession that was lost by the Bolshevik government in the early 20th century, you'd be very worried, I think, as to what that said about Russian ambitions and Russian aspirations beyond just Ukraine.
Give us a sense of the military firepower of Russia compared to Ukraine and how well Ukraine could defend itself, because it's clear that there are not going to be Western forces sent in to help them.
Ukraine's army has come a long way since 2014. It's bigger, it has better Western arms, including thousands of anti-tank missiles sent in the last couple of months. The problem is that Russia's army is also better. You know, it's improved substantially. It's fought in Syria, it's fought in eastern Ukraine, it's learnt all these lessons. It has had lots of spending lavished on it. And I think that with particularly Russian air supremacy, that the Ukrainians haven't got very good air defences. The ones they have will probably be destroyed very quickly indeed. The Ukrainian Air Force will be effectively grounded. I think Russia will have command of the skies. It will be able to stop Ukrainian forces manoeuvring around the battlefield to reinforce different areas. And Russia will be able to simply bypass big concentrations of Ukrainian forces when it needs to. And I think Ukraine's armed forces will suffer heavy casualties and they will not be able to withstand a Russian assault. Of course, that's not to say that Russia will be able to occupy Ukraine or large parts of eastern Ukraine without a very severe long-term consequences and partisan warfare. But Ukraine, in the early phases of this conflict, is going to lose.
So when you talk like that, how prolonged could this be once it escalates to, you know, to its full level that he intends?
It depends on Russian aims. What Western security officials are still telling me is that they think a major attack on Ukraine is still the likeliest outcome, which would include a strike on Kiev. And indeed, both Boris Johnson and Joe Biden have openly said that in the last week alone. If that is the case, and if the Russian aim is to install a pro-Russian regime in Kiev and to change the orientation of the government, and on balance, I still think that that is probably where we will end up. I think you could be looking at a long, difficult, bloody campaign that would be in the domain of years, not months.
And for the region, how destabilising is this? I mean, it doesn't seem, as you pointed out, I mean, you know, the Nord Stream pipeline seems to be now off the agenda. There are going to be crippling sanctions if the US and others follow. This could be very destabilising for the region for some time.
Profoundly so. First of all, you're going to have Russian forces and NATO forces in close proximity in a very dangerous way. And there are people concerned about possible accidents, possible escalation. You'll have cyber activity that could spill out beyond Ukraine's borders. And beyond that, you'll have massive refugee flows into places like Poland and Romania. I think the polls have said they anticipate up to 1 million people flooding into their country. And we know how those refugee flows can have very destabilizing political consequences in Europe, as we saw back in 2015. NATO will have to reinforce its eastern front. It will have to make very large movements and reinforcements. Those are just some of the consequences I can imagine. There are many, many others. This is certainly going to be the most destabilizing act in European security for 25 years since the Balkan Wars. And I think it will probably exceed that conflict in terms of the scale and severity of the ramifications.
Shashank, appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Ukraine's ambassador to Australia says the Russian president's peacekeeping orders in eastern Ukraine indicate the situation is intensifying. Volodymyr Shalkivsky says that continued international pressure needs to be applied.
It's a clear sign of escalation of the situation when one country sends its military troops under the peacekeeping kind of justification to the territory of the sovereign state. Our military on high alert, of course, but we will appreciate any kind of assistance from international community in this situation. And we still rely on diplomacy. We still would like to avoid full-scale invasion, full-scale war. And that is why we are calling on the political and security assistance to our partners.
Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has described Russia's decree as a blatant violation of international law. Mr. Guterres' statement was read out at a late-night meeting of world officials by his spokesman.
The Secretary-General is greatly concerned by the decision by the Russian Federation related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine. He calls for the peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine in accordance with the Minsk Agreement, as endorsed by the Security Council in 2015. The Secretary-General considers the decision of the Russian Federation to be a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The United Nations, in line with the relevant General Assembly resolutions, remains fully supportive of the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders.
Well, the international editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher, says while this is the fourth time Russia has violated international borders, this is becoming an all too common phenomenon elsewhere.
Well, it tells us that it's a fiction, a polite fiction that we've been telling ourselves, that the UN Charter is real and applies, that countries respect international borders. And even in this case, it's a border that Moscow itself recognized formally in 1991. And yet today we hear Vladimir Putin say that Ukraine, now he said Ukraine, not just eastern Ukraine, so not just the strip that they've covertly been occupying and are now moving to formally annex, but he said Ukraine is an inalienable part of Russia's historical, social, and spiritual space. So according to his definition, a legal border which of course is the fundamental definition of sovereignty in the UN Charter, as well as everywhere else, including Russia's own recognition, is less important than spiritual space and historical considerations. So according to Russia, it's not real. This is the fourth time Vladimir Putin has violated borders. First was Georgia in 2008, and this is the third time now in Ukraine. He's not alone. It was the US in Iraq in 2003, cheered on by John Howard and Tony Blair, that illegally invaded Iraq, just as it was Xi Jinping has been taking maritime territories in the South China Sea from the Philippines and others, contrary to a ruling by the International Arbitral Court of The Hague. So there's three great powers, all three of them helping themselves to the territory of of other countries when it suits them.
Mm. And when you talk of those three mega powers, superpowers, although Russia is less one these days, what sanction is going to have any impact?
Well, exactly right. You can't say that Vladimir Putin wasn't warned of sanctions led by the US, but also other NATO countries and an array of other countries around the world. The Western powers and some others have been spelling out very clearly what sanctions would apply if he were to go ahead. And he's looked at that list of costs, and he's looked at the territory he wants and decided it's worth the price. So that tells you, I would suggest, Bev, that short of someone actually intervening physically to prevent him crossing the border, no sanction is going to work. He's been threatened with every non-kinetic sanction, just about, that the Western world can think of.
And, you know, the US, as you point out, has talked a lot, and certainly the West has come out very strongly in opposition to what he's doing. But the reality is they are not going to do anything practical. So the US is wanting to defend Ukraine, but it has bigger issues on its plate, as you have pointed out before.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in the column that I had in this morning's papers, Bev, quoting authoritative American strategists, the author of the most recent US National Defense Strategy, Elbridge Colby, and also the guy who's currently Joe Biden's chief China advisor in the White House, Rush Joshi, both of them saying, so one was working for Donald Trump, the other is working for Joe Biden, but both converge on this same point. It's exactly as you say, Bev. Russia, for all its power, is not the main game. For the US, the main game is China. They see the China contest as being an all-consuming one. They say that they can't afford, that the US can't afford to be detained or entangled or distracted by any physical or kinetic hot war with Russia. That Russia is, I mean, we know Russia's economy is 1/10 the size of China's, and its power is declining relatively. Its economy is around the same size as Australia's, and it's smaller than South Korea's. The US sees Russia as the crisis of the moment, but not the crisis of the decade or the century. And Joe Biden himself has said the US is engaged in what he calls the competition with China for the 21st century. They see, all of those figures see China as the unique threat to the US, the only country capable of, if it can establish hegemony in Asia, would allow it to aggregate enough economic power, most of the world economy, under its hegemony, to then give it the heft to be able to threaten the US with economic coercion, and beyond that, using that to threaten its liberty and its prosperity. So that is the big challenge they see. They see China as a peer competitor, and they don't have time or resources to deal forcefully with Russia.
Scott Morrison has condemned the action and has described the pretext as nonsense, as many other Western nations have. How might Scott Morrison use this, though? What might be the implications for us?
Well, there are two. One is a natural, logical, and I would suggest to you, realistic extension of the lesson now being learned at the expense of the people of Ukraine. And that is that there is no rules-based order. There is no order the only rule is the rule of the jungle, the law of the jungle, and the only order is the order of battle. And that while today it's Russia ignoring international law, convention, and the UN Charter, tomorrow it will be someone else. And the country that everybody, I think, has most to worry about is China. Vastly more powerful, much more crafty, less obvious, less brazen than Putin, for whom putting on a show seems to be half the motivation. So that's the first point, is that we should expect other countries, not just Russia, to behave like this and to expect to get away with it. That's the first point. The second point is more domestic and political. And the political point is the Liberals, the coalition government here, considers that as long as national security is the subject that we're talking about, then that naturally predisposes us to thinking favourably about the Liberal Party because of long-standing brand associations the coalition has on national security as one of its two strengths, together with economic management. And so Scott Morrison sees this as 3 months' worth of talking points where he can warn of instability, insecurity, threats to the international order and threats to Australia.
Good to talk as always, Peter. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Bev.
Well, in developing news, Germany has halted approval of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia in response to Putin's declarations. It's expected to be just one of several economic sanctions to be imposed as a result of Russia's aggression. Back home, the Morrison government says it'll be in lockstep with its allies when they decide to introduce sanctions on Russia. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Russian troops poised to deliver their president's decree. Vladimir Putin claims their dispatch into eastern Ukraine is for peacekeeping. The rest of the world sees it otherwise.
An attack on Ukraine is an attack on the sovereignty of every UN member state.
It's unacceptable, it's unprovoked, it's unwarranted.
Australia joining international condemnation of Russia's aggression amid deep concern over what it might mean for the people of Ukraine.
Absolutely violent confrontation with terrible human consequences.
We call upon Russia to back off.
Australia and allies are determining whether President Putin's so-called peacekeeping mission constitutes a military invasion, although Kiev is in no doubt.
We need strong political condemnation. We need sanctions as soon as possible.
If Russia is hit with sanctions, it will be coordinated. The National Security Committee of Cabinet is believed to have Australian penalties ready once the US and the UK act.
The moment that other countries put in place strong and severe sanctions, we will be in lockstep with them.
Significant sanctions already exist against Russia, dating back to the downing of flight MH17 in Ukraine that killed all on board, including 38 Australians.
I'm going to shirt front, Mr. Putin. You bet you are. You bet I am.
Tony Abbott's government slapped travel bans on certain individuals and suspended some financial and trade ties, including a uranium supply agreement reached between President Putin and John Howard 15 years ago. Australians in Ukraine were advised to leave the country weeks ago, and there's talk that some Ukrainians forced to flee could be offered safe haven in Australia. But the biggest question out of all of this is whether the United States and the West really have the stomach to stand up to Vladimir Putin, because another autocrat in Beijing, who also has territorial ambitions, is hanging on the answer. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
And while the political machinations are continuing for those who live in Ukraine, life is becoming ever more uncertain. Bryce Wilson is an Australian photojournalist who has lived in Donetsk on and off since 2015. He was speaking from near the front lines, and he says people in eastern Ukraine are increasingly nervous.
I'm seeing too, as we get closer to the front line, the streets are getting emptier. There are less people here. You can see there are cars and everything driving around, but in the city where I was living in Kramatorsk, people are starting to leave. One of my friends is preparing to evacuate his family from this area because they are concerned that as a result of the occupied territories essentially making a legal claim to the whole state, not just sorry, not just where the current front line is, but the whole state. They're really fearful and afraid that there will be a mass invasion in this whole area.
Hours before ordering Russian troops into eastern Ukraine, President Putin signed a decree that two of the regions of the country he recognised as independent states. The two regions are home to Russian-backed rebels who've been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014.
It was an astonishing piece of political theatre, played out on Russian TV. The protagonist, the president, Vladimir Putin, alone, aloof, like a modern-day czar. The supporting cast, members of Russia's powerful Security Council. I will let you all speak, he said. Then we must decide what to do. And one by one, they spoke, all urging President Putin to defy Kiev and the West and officially recognise the pro-Russia rebel republics in eastern Ukraine. We must recognise these republics, the Interior Minister says, but within their earlier, larger boundaries. The President listened, but looked like a man who'd already made up his mind. Later, he addressed the nation.
The essence of the aggressive nationalistic character of the regime that seized power in Kiev hasn't changed. I consider it necessary to immediately recognise the independence and sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics.
Act 2, the signing ceremony. The leaders of the rebel republics were already in Moscow. They clearly knew what President Putin's decision would be. Earlier, this. Russian TV claimed Ukraine was shelling the rebel republics. Fake news, Kiev says, and Moscow inventing a pretext for military intervention. In recent days, thousands of civilians from the separatist republics have been evacuated to Russia. Moscow's been accused of using these people as political pawns. Many here are confused and frightened by what's been happening. The geopolitical consequences of Vladimir Putin's decision are not their priority. Tonight, in the rebel republics Russia has recognised, celebrations. But elsewhere in Ukraine and in the West, deep concern.
Well, what is driving this latest power play from the Russian president, and is it only Ukraine he has in his sights? Samuel Greene is the director of the Russia Institute and professor of Russian politics at King's College London, and he joins us out of Durham, North Carolina in the US. Sam, good of you to be up so early. Quite a dramatic development, which I'm sure you're watching closely. What did you make of this initial move by Putin? As you know, there's been this talk of a broader invasion of Ukraine for so many weeks now.
Well, given that, just last week he was telling us that he thought there was still room for diplomacy, and he was giving marching orders essentially to his diplomats to keep talking to the West on the strategic security discussions they've now been having for several weeks. It was, I think, somewhat jarring to see that he was giving marching orders to troops as well. It's not entirely surprising. I think this is one of the options that we knew was on the menu. But the reality is we still don't know where this is going, right? So he gave this speech that your report discussed that, really could be, it was quite aggressive, it was quite broad. It's really easy to interpret as justifying an invasion and really the occupation of the entirety of Ukraine, if that's what he decided to do. It was designed to draw up the support for that. In the end, he did something much more modest, although it's not minor from a geopolitical standpoint, right? And I think we'll have to see, what he does next. At the moment, there is still the possibility of avoiding a shooting war. I think he will be looking to see how Ukraine responds, how the West responds to this initial intervention and then make a decision about whether he wants to or needs to or can do something next.
So, Sam, let's talk about that, the response and how critical that is. Many say his current aggression is because there was so little response to the various plays that he's already made against Crimea, against Georgia, in Belarus, and, of course, already in Ukraine. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's deterrence is a hard thing to prove, right? Because there have been certain things done that have been damaging to the Russian economy. They've been damaging to his personal interests. But clearly, whatever whatever is motivating this from his point of view is outweighing that. Understanding exactly why he's done what he's done yesterday and today is difficult, because from most standpoints, it would seem to make him worse off, and it would certainly seem to make Russia worse off. We can look at what's happened to financial markets, and we know that there will be sanctions coming. I think it's probably more fruitful to focus on what might happen next, right? So he seems to be putting troops right up to the current ceasefire line. He will have to make a decision about whether he wants to do what some of his advisors have said and cross that and go much further into Ukrainian territory. In which case that will start a shooting war, but it will also ramp up the sanctions, right? So there will be targeted sanctions from the U.S. and from Europe as a result of just recognizing the republics and moving troops formally into Ukraine. But there are much larger sanctions on the table, sanctions that are capable essentially of turning the Russian economy into the Iranian economy. And he will need to think very carefully about whether that's something he can countenance, especially given that Russian public opinion may not be entirely behind this war.
When you watch the theatrics of the declaration of the independence of these regions and then him signing, the peacekeeping troops to go into those territories, one feels that he is sort of driven on this despite the economic cost. So what is his end goal?
Well, again, it's a very difficult question to figure out, because if you think about what he's said is his end goal, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, well, what he's done yesterday probably actually makes NATO membership more likely than it was before. It certainly galvanizes opinion in Ukraine, and I think it galvanizes opinion among the NATO allies. So that does not seem to have been the goal, at least if he's consistent. I think making it very difficult for Ukraine to govern itself and to pursue European integration is and has been a goal. And to the extent that Ukraine finds itself caught up in a war of one scale or another, that's something that he can press on. But I think he's also pressing towards restructuring fundamentally the relationship between Russia and the rest of the world, something where he may feel he has a bit more independence, even if the country as a whole is a bit poorer off. One of the themes that came up a lot in his speech and in a lot of his speeches over the years has been this idea that the U.S. is pushing into Eastern Europe, it's pushing into Ukraine, essentially because it wants Russia, as currently structured, to cease to exist, or at the very least to not be able to develop. And so I think this to a large extent is an exercise in using the Russian military to set up defensive bulwarks, essentially, in Europe, to draw and defend lines on the map in ways that he thinks, for whatever reason, will increase his personal security, the security of his regime.
Yeah. How plausible are statements still coming out of the Kremlin that they are open to diplomacy when we have witnessed what we did today?
About as plausible as the statements that we heard over the previous weeks that they're not planning an invasion, right? I mean, they will keep talking, and the West will keep talking, because it could always be worse, right? And there are questions of strategic security, nuclear security, missile defense, those sorts of things that really do need to get talked out, even when relations are at their bottom point, and maybe even particularly when relations at their bottom point. So I think we will see those conversations go ahead, but they're not likely to be conversations about Ukraine. They're likely to be conversations about really the relationship between Moscow, Brussels, Washington.
Sam Greene, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.